A Jew from New York, an Arab from Yemen, and a Druze from the Lebanese mountains walk into a genetics lab. This isn't a joke. It's the result of one of the largest genetic studies ever conducted, and what scientists discovered changed everything we thought we knew about ancestry and identity. Here's what happened. Their DNA was closer to each other than to their next-door neighbors. Think about that for a moment. People who have been taught to see themselves as fundamentally different, separated by religion, culture, and centuries of conflict, are actually genetic cousins. Today, we're diving into something most people don't talk about openly. Jewish DNA has become one of the most studied genetic profiles on Earth, and the findings have shocked everyone from religious leaders to political activists. Some of these discoveries confirm ancient religious texts. Others completely destroy long-held beliefs about who we are and where we came from. We're going to explore 4 major points. First, what Jewish DNA actually is from a scientific perspective, and whether it even exists as a real phenomenon. Second, the history of how geneticists started searching for biblical priests in modern people and what they found instead. Third, we'll compare Jewish and Arabic genetic profiles in detail to see what connects them and what sets them apart at the molecular level. And fourth, how this scientific data is being used and sometimes twisted in modern political debates. But here's something incredible. At the end, I'm going to tell you about one genetic marker that appears in a huge portion of Middle Eastern populations. Some researchers believe this marker connects back to one specific person who lived 4,000 years ago. Yes, we're talking about Abraham, the figure considered the forefather of both Jews and Arabs. Is this scientific fact or just a beautiful interpretation? Stay with me until the end to find out what the evidence really shows. Let me start with something that confuses almost everyone. Strictly speaking, Jewish DNA doesn't exist. There is no single gene or set of genes that makes someone Jewish. Genetics doesn't check documents at the synagogue door. But here's where it gets interesting. Geneticists can identify Jewish ancestry with stunning accuracy. How does this work? We're not talking about one gene. We're talking about combinations of genetic markers whose frequencies vary statistically across populations. Think of it like an accent. There's no such thing as a single Russian sound or English sound, but you can instantly tell a native speaker from a foreigner based on overall pronunciation. Population genetics works exactly the same way. Professor Harry Ostra from New York University is one of the world's leading experts on Jewish genetics. In his book, Heritage, A Genetic History, he wrote something fascinating. Jews are not a race, but they have racial characteristics. Jews are not a nation, but they have national characteristics. Jews demonstrate a unique combination of genetic signatures that reflect their history. And this is where things get really strange. When geneticists started systematically studying DNA from Jewish communities around the world, Ashkenazim from Eastern Europe, Sephardim from Spain and North Africa, Mizrahi Jews from Iraq and Iran, Yemenite Jews, Ethiopian Beta Israel, Indian B'nai Israel, they discovered something nobody expected. These communities were scattered across the entire planet. They lived in complete isolation from each other for centuries, sometimes for millennia. They didn't communicate, they didn't intermarry. Yet somehow they all retained a common genetic core. A study published in Nature in 2010 analyzed the genomes of 14 different Jewish communities. The results were undeniable. All of them grouped together on genetic maps, forming one distinct cluster. Even more surprising, this cluster was closer to Middle Eastern populations than to European ones, despite many of these Jews having lived in Europe for 1,000 years. But wait, it gets better. Scientists used mathematical models to estimate when these Jewish communities diverged from each other. The dates they calculated matched historical records almost perfectly. The split between Middle Eastern and European Jewish communities happened about 2,500 years ago, which lines up exactly with the Babylonian exile and the diaspora that followed. Genetics, without even trying, confirmed biblical chronology, or at least it didn't contradict it. The reaction to these studies was explosive. Ultra-Orthodox rabbis declared that Jewishness is defined by religious law, not genetics, and that reducing national identity to nucleotides offends tradition. Meanwhile, anti-Semites received an unexpected blow. Their favorite theory that Ashkenazi Jews are actually descendants of Khazars with no connection to biblical Israelites proved genetically impossible. But here's something nobody expected to find. The Jewish genome hasn't stayed frozen for millennia. Research shows significant contributions from local populations to the gene pool of various Jewish communities. Ashkenazi Jews, for example, carry 30 to 50% European genetic markers, primarily on the maternal side. This means that in the early period of Ashkenazi community formation, local European women converted to Judaism and entered the community. But the paternal lineage, traceable on the Y chromosome, remains predominantly Middle Eastern. Think about what this means. Jewish identity was transmitted through fathers whose genetic line traces back to the Middle East, while the mothers were often European. It's this combination, a Middle Eastern core plus regional admixtures, that creates the unique genetic profile scientists call Jewish DNA. Now that we understand what we're dealing with, let's talk about how this research began. And trust me, it started with one of the craziest scientific experiments you've ever heard of. In 1997, a group of scientists led by Professor Karl Skórecki from the Technion Israel Institute of Technology decided to test something that sounded absolutely insane. They wanted to find genetic evidence for the biblical priestly line of the Cohens. According to Jewish tradition, all Cohens are descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. The status of Cohen is passed through the paternal line and has supposedly been preserved in families for 3,500 years. But was this really true? Or just a beautiful legend with no basis in reality? Researchers collected DNA samples from men who identified themselves as Cohens and analyzed their Y chromosome. Remember, the Y chromosome passes from father to son virtually unchanged, making it perfect for tracing paternal lines over many generations. The results exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. Most Cohens, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, carried the same set of genetic markers. Scientists called it the Cohen modal haplotype. The probability that this was coincidence was almost zero. But here's where it gets unbelievable. Calculations showed that the common ancestor of all these men lived approximately 3,000 years ago, which roughly corresponds to the biblical date of the Exodus from Egypt. This discovery exploded like a bomb in the scientific community. For the first time in history, genetic data independently confirmed biblical tradition. Of course, this didn't prove Moses or Aaron existed as historical figures, but it demonstrated that the tradition of passing priestly status from father to son had been observed for thousands of years. The article was published in Nature and is still cited today. But this study opened a Pandora's box of questions. Can genetics be used to determine ethnic and religious affiliation? These questions remain controversial today. Following their success with the Cohens, researchers took on something far more ambitious, mapping the entire Jewish genome and comparing it with other populations. In 2008, an international team published results from a massive study analyzing genomes from 13 Jewish communities worldwide. The main conclusion was stated simply and scientifically, but behind these words was a real sensation. All Jewish communities are more closely connected to each other than to the surrounding non-Jewish populations. Regardless of where Jews lived for the past 2,000 years, their genome retained the imprint of common origin. But the study revealed something else, something that made headlines around the world and sparked fierce debate. Among all populations on Earth, the closest genetic relatives of Jews were not Europeans, not Africans, not Central Asians. Their closest relatives turned out to be Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and other peoples of the Levant. In other words, genetics confirmed what religious tradition had maintained for millennia. Jews and Arabs are cousins. Geneticist Doron Bahar, one of the study's co-authors, said something remarkable. Genetics doesn't know politics. DNA doesn't read newspapers or vote in elections. It just shows us who descended from whom. And, in this case, the picture is crystal clear. The study of mitochondrial DNA, which transmits exclusively through the maternal line, revealed even more complexity. Mitochondrial haplogroups of Ashkenazi Jews showed significant European component, indicating that many women who became foremothers of Ashkenazi Jewry were of European descent. However, paternal lines remained predominantly Middle Eastern. This discovery sparked heated debate. Some interpreted it as evidence of mass conversion of European women to Judaism in the early Ashkenazi community. Others assumed it resulted from mixed marriages in later periods. There's still no consensus, but the asymmetry between maternal and paternal inheritance is universally recognized. In 2010, another landmark study tackled the so-called Khazar hypothesis. This theory, popularized by writer Arthur Koestler in his book The 13th Tribe, claimed that Ashkenazi Jews have no genetic connection with ancient Israelites, but are descendants of Khazars, a Turkic people whose ruling elite converted to Judaism in the 8th century. This theory was extremely popular in certain circles because, if true, it would undermine Jewish claims to historical connection with the land of Israel. However, genetic studies dealt a serious blow to the Khazar hypothesis. DNA analysis of Ashkenazi Jews revealed no significant Turkic or Central Asian component. Instead, their genome showed a typical Middle Eastern profile with European admixtures, but not Khazar. Professor Harry Ostra was blunt about these results. The Khazar hypothesis is so 19th century, genetics is so 21st century, the data speaks for itself. Not all geneticists were so categorical. In 2013, Israeli geneticist Eran El-Haik published a study claiming to have discovered significant Khazar contribution to the Ashkenazi genome. His work sparked heated debate and was heavily criticized for methodological shortcomings. Most population geneticists didn't accept his findings, but the fact that discussion continues shows how politically charged this research field is. Now that we've traced the history, let's address the main question. What's common and what's different in Jewish and Arabic DNA? The answer might surprise you. Here's a fact that surprises most people, especially those who think of Jews and Arabs as irreconcilable opponents. From a genetic perspective, they're among the closest populations on the planet. Closer than French and Germans. Closer than Russians and Poles. Closer even than residents of neighboring villages in some parts of the world. The basis for this similarity is Y chromosome haplogroups. Most Jews and Arabs are dominated by haplogroups J1 and J2. These haplogroups arose in the Middle East and spread from there, throughout the world. J1 is especially characteristic of Arabs, particularly those living in the Arabian Peninsula and Levant. J2 is more common among Jews, though it also appears in many Arab populations. But here's the critical point. Both haplogroups share a common ancestor who lived approximately 25 to 30,000 years ago. In genetic terms, that's practically yesterday. For comparison, the common ancestor of Europeans and East Asians lived 50 to 60,000 years ago. A 2009 study published in Human Genetics compared genetic profiles of Jewish communities with Arab populations from different regions. The results were revealing. Jews from all communities, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, grouped together with Arabs from the Levant, Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians. This general cluster clearly separated from European and African populations. The authors concluded, the genetic data support the hypothesis that Jews and Palestinian Arabs share a common origin with the ancient population of the region, which subsequently divided along religious and cultural lines. An even more detailed study, conducted in 2012 by a group led by Sheikh Sarfati from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, analyzed more than 600,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are tiny DNA variations that differ among individuals and allow very precise determination of kinship degree. The results showed that Druze, Bedouins, and Christian Arabs of the Levant are genetically virtually indistinguishable from Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews stood slightly apart due to European admixture, but were still significantly closer to Middle Eastern populations than to European ones. When these results were presented at a scientific conference, one participant joked that now it's clear why Israelis and Palestinians understand each other so well when they argue. At the molecular level, they're practically brothers. But differences exist, and they're equally interesting. One key difference involves the so-called founder effect. When a small group breaks away from the main population and begins reproducing in isolation, certain genetic variants may become disproportionately common in their descendants simply because they happen to be present in the founders. This is exactly what happened to Ashkenazi Jews. Geneticists estimate that all Ashkenazi Jews, numbering around 10 million today, descend from a population of just a few hundred people who lived in the Rhineland approximately 1,000 years ago. This resulted in several specific genetic characteristics. First, Ashkenazi Jews exhibit unusually low genetic diversity compared to other populations of comparable size. Genetically, all Ashkenazi Jews are approximately 31st cousins. Second, certain genetic mutations that would remain rare in the general population became relatively common among Ashkenazi Jews. This concerns both neutral mutations and mutations associated with genetic diseases. The story of Tay-Sachs disease is particularly illustrative. This severe neurodegenerative disease occurs in Ashkenazi Jews approximately 100 times more often than in the general population. About 1 in 30 Ashkenazi Jews carries this mutation. Why? Because one or more founders of the Ashkenazi community were accidentally carriers of this mutation, and it spread among their descendants. But what about other Jewish communities? Each one tells a completely different genetic story. If you could look into the DNA of representatives from different Jewish communities, you'd discover that the Jewish people aren't a monolithic group. They're a constellation of interconnected populations, each carrying its own unique genetic history. Let's start with Ashkenazim, the largest and most studied Jewish group. Ashkenazi Jews make up 70 to 80% of all Jews worldwide. Their ancestors lived in Central and Eastern Europe, and their genetic profile reflects this history. Genetic studies show the Ashkenazi genome represents a mixture of Middle Eastern and European components in approximately a 50-50 ratio. However, the distribution is uneven. The paternal line, traced on the Y chromosome, is 80% Middle Eastern. The maternal line, traced by mitochondrial DNA, is 80% European. This creates a paradoxical picture. Ashkenazi Jews are genetically half European, but their Jewish identity was transmitted primarily through the paternal line, which remains Middle Eastern. A 2013 study by a team led by Martin Richards from the University of Huddersfield attempted to identify specific European foremothers of Ashkenazim. The results were unexpected. About 80% of Ashkenazi maternal lines can be traced back to just 4 women who lived in Europe about 1,000 years ago. These 4 women were likely either European converts to Judaism or offspring of mixed marriages. Scholars gave them tentative names: N1b, K1A1B1A, K1A9, and K2XUA. It doesn't sound as poetic as Sarah or Rebecca, but for genetics it's quite romantic. Now let's move to Sephardim. Sephardic Jews are descendants of communities expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492. After expulsion, they dispersed across the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Balkans, Italy. Unlike Ashkenazim, Sephardim exhibit significantly higher percentage of Middle Eastern markers on both paternal and maternal lines. The European component is present, but it's predominantly Southern European: Spanish, Italian, Greek. This makes sense. Sephardim lived in Iberia for almost 1,500 years, since the time of the Roman Empire, and inevitably mixed with local populations. Genetic studies made it possible to identify descendants of conversos or Marranos, Jews forcibly converted to Christianity during the Spanish Inquisition. Many modern Spaniards and Latin Americans who never suspected their Jewish origin find characteristic Sephardic markers in their DNA. According to some estimates, up to 20% of modern Spain's population and up to 25% of some Latin American regions carry Sephardic genetic markers. Mizrahi Jews from Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and Kurdistan represent genetically the most pure Middle Eastern line. They never left their region of origin and lived in relative isolation from other Jewish communities for 2.5 millennia. Their DNA is practically free of European admixtures, but contains small contributions from local populations: Persian among Iranian Jews, Mesopotamian among Iraqi Jews. Yemenite Jews are particularly interesting. Their community existed in isolation for more than 2,000 years, preserving not only unique religious traditions but also a specific genetic profile. Studies show Yemenite Jews are genetically very close to ancient DNA samples extracted from archaeological finds in Israel. This makes them a unique living time capsule, offering glimpses into the genetics of ancient Israelites. One Yemenite rabbi, upon learning of this research, joked, "For 2,000 years we sat in the mountains of Yemen and waited for science to prove what we already knew. We didn't have to wait." But then there's the most mysterious Jewish community of all. And what scientists found in their DNA changed everything. Ethiopian Jews, known as Beta Israel, have origins shrouded in mystery. According to one legend, they are descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. According to another, they are descendants of the tribe of Dan, separated from the rest of the Israelites in biblical times. Genetic studies yielded mixed results. On one hand, Ethiopian Jews are genetically very close to other Ethiopian peoples and practically indistinguishable from them by most markers. On the other hand, some exhibit a small but statistically significant Middle Eastern component. This may indicate the community was founded by a small group of migrants from the Middle East who then mixed with local populations, or that local Ethiopians adopted Judaism under influence of Jewish traders or missionaries. The debate over Ethiopian Jews' status continues today. From a genetic perspective, they're the least Jewish of all recognized Jewish communities. But from religious and traditional perspectives, they practiced Judaism for centuries without any contact with the rest of the Jewish world. What's more important, genes or faith? This question goes far beyond genetics. Another interesting group is Indian Jews of Bnei Israel. According to their tradition, they're descendants of Jews who survived a shipwreck off India's coast more than 2,000 years ago. Genetic research partially confirmed this legend. Bnei Israel men have Middle Eastern Y chromosomal haplogroups, but mitochondrial DNA is predominantly Indian. In other words, the founding men did come from the Middle East, but they married local women. There are also Chinese Jews from Kaifeng, Georgian, Jews, Mountain Jews from the Caucasus, and Bukharan Jews of Central Asia. Each community has a unique genetic history, a unique combination of Jewish core and local admixtures. But despite all this diversity, the red thread of Middle Eastern origin can be traced in everyone, albeit to varying degrees. Now let's talk about what scientists prefer to speak cautiously about or not speak about at all: the political dimension of genetic research. Because DNA doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a world where people kill each other over land, identity, and history. Results of genetic research are actively used in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Both sides find confirmation of their positions, which is ironic enough in itself. The pro-Israel side points out that genetics confirms Jewish connection with the ancient population of the region. Jews aren't colonizers from Europe, as anti-Israeli propaganda claims, but returnees to their ancestral land. The Middle Eastern genetic core is present, even among Ashkenazi Jews whose ancestors lived in Europe for almost 2,000 years. The pro-Palestinian side emphasizes that Palestinians are genetically indistinguishable from the region's Jews. This means they're equally indigenous to this land, and attempts to expel them constitute ethnic cleansing of people molecularly identical to those expelling them. Some claim Palestinians are descendants of ancient Israelites who converted to Islam and therefore have more rights to the land than European Jews. Who's right? From a purely scientific perspective, no one and everyone simultaneously. Genetics doesn't issue certificates of land ownership. It simply shows who descended from whom. Drawing conclusions about what to do with this information is politics, not science. Professor Harry Ostra was harsh on this issue. Genetics should not be used to determine people's rights to territory. That's the road to hell. If we start distributing land based on whose ancestors lived there, longer, we'll have to evict almost the entire population of the planet. But the problem goes far beyond Middle Eastern conflict. In recent years, commercial genetic testing popularity has increased dramatically. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and MyHeritage offer everyone the opportunity to discover their ancestry for $100 or $2. The results create as many problems as they solve. Imagine this. A person who identified as Jewish their entire life receives test results showing 0% Jewish ancestry. Or, vice versa, a confirmed anti-Semite discovers significant Jewish component in his DNA. It sounds like comedy plot, but for these individuals, these are real identity crises. In Israel, genetic testing has taken on particular importance in the context of the law of return, which grants immigration rights to anyone who can prove Jewish origin. In 2013, Israel's Ministry of the Interior began requiring genetic tests from some immigrant applicants, especially from the former Soviet Union. This caused a storm of criticism from both human rights activists and religious authorities. The chief rabbinate of Israel officially stated that Jewishness is defined by halakha, not genetics, and DNA test results cannot serve as proof of Jewish ancestry. But in practice, these tests continue being used in controversial cases, creating a legal gray area. Another problem relates to what I call genetic essentialism, the idea that your DNA defines who you are. This is a dangerous misconception. A person isn't a set of nucleotides. A person is culture, language, upbringing, choice. Your ancestors are an important part of your history, but they're not a death sentence or a pass. Many African Americans find significant European component, a consequence of the slavery era and forced ties. Does this make them less African American? Of course not. Identity is shaped by history, not just biology. The same applies to Jews. A person who grew up in a Jewish family, observes traditions, and identifies as Jewish doesn't become less Jewish if a genetic test shows high percentage of unexpected admixtures. And a person who discovers Jewish ancestry in a test doesn't automatically become Jewish unless they're connected to Jewish culture and tradition. There's another delicate aspect rarely discussed publicly: potential for genetic data to be used for eugenic purposes. I'm not talking about something apocalyptic like Nazi programs. Hopefully we've learned enough from history. But milder forms of eugenics already exist. Dr. Yesharim, a program that genetically tests young people for certain diseases, is widespread in Orthodox Jewish communities. Before families agree to marriage, they check whether potential spouses are genetically compatible. If both carry the same dangerous mutation, marriage isn't recommended. On one hand, this program saved thousands of children from severe genetic diseases. On the other, it's pure eugenics, even if voluntary and well-intentioned. Where's the line between preventing suffering and selecting desirable genes? But now, let me tell you about the discovery that connects everything together. In 2015, a group of researchers led by Professor Mark Jobling from the University of Leicester conducted large-scale analysis of Y chromosome lineages in the Middle East. They found that a certain subgroup of haplogroup J1, designated J1p58, appears at high frequency in Arabs, Jews, Druze, Bedouins, and other Semitic peoples. Calculations showed the common ancestor of all carriers of this haplogroup lived approximately 4,000 years ago in the Levant or northern Mesopotamia region. 4,000 years ago. Levant or Mesopotamia. Common ancestor of Arabs and Jews. According to biblical chronology, Abraham lived at this time and in this place. Of course, this isn't proof. It may be just coincidence. Perhaps the common ancestor wasn't Abraham, but some other man who lived in the same region at the same time. Genetics can't read names written in DNA. But you have to admit, the coincidence is astonishing. One of the study's co-authors commented, "We can't say we've found Abraham, but we've found someone who lived at the right time, in the right place, and whose descendants spread exactly as described by biblical tradition. The interpretation of this data is a matter of faith, not science." The biblical story of Abraham becoming father of many nations takes on unexpected meaning in light of genetic data. Perhaps ancient authors of these texts knew more about their origins than we're accustomed to thinking, or perhaps they simply guessed, or perhaps they created a beautiful myth that happened to be close to truth. So let's summarize. First, Jewish DNA as such doesn't exist. There's no Jewish gene, but there's a unique combination of genetic markers allowing identification of Jewish ancestry with high accuracy. This combination reflects the people's history, a common Middle Eastern core plus regional admixtures accumulated over millennia of diaspora. Second, genetic studies convincingly confirmed that Jewish communities from around the world are related to each other. Ashkenazi Jews from Poland and Yemenite Mizrahi Jews do share common ancestors. Traditional notions of Jewish people unity found scientific support. Third, Jews and Arabs are genetic cousins. Their common origin from ancient Levant population is beyond doubt. Main differences aren't related to original genetic material, but to different population histories. Fourth, genetics shouldn't be used to determine political rights or territorial claims. This is a study of the past, not a guide to action in the present. We live in an era when science can confirm or disprove ancient legends with unprecedented accuracy. But what should we do with this knowledge? Use it to unite people, showing them how close they really are, or to divide them, finding differences where there are almost none? Jews and Arabs have fought each other for centuries. But their DNA tells a different story, the story of shared ancestors, shared land, shared destiny. As one Israeli geneticist said after another study, "You know what's the most ironic thing? If Abraham took a DNA test today, he wouldn't be able to tell if he was Jewish or Arab. Because this division didn't exist back then. We invented it ourselves. There are no pure peoples. There are no chosen genes. There's only infinitely complex, intricate, wondrous history of humanity written in every cell of our being.